war to end all wars, which began in 1914, was dominated by bullets, spades, and barbed wire. The early battles of maneuver soon bogged down in seemingly endless trench warfare, in which artillery and machine guns were the principal weapons. Every year the ghastly conflict dragged on, the losses mounted, with neither side being able to gain an advantage. The endless offensives and counter-offensives each cost hundreds of thousands of lives with no tangible results. When the United States entered the war in 1917 and the Russian Revolution ended the conflict in the East, the situation slowly began to change, although the style of warfare initially did not. The infantry still hacked their way through the barbed wire, only to fall in droves to the insatiable machine guns. Eventually, a solution was found. The tank and self-propelled gun finally broke the stalemate, and Germany capitulated in 1918. But the war had cost some 8 million deaths and traumatized a generation. The Allies vowed that Germany would pay, and the reparations were punitive. The defeated German nation was demoralized and desperate, with inflation running so high that money was worthless. The people sought both answers and salvation, and to growing numbers of them in the late 1920s and early 30s, Adolf Hitler's National Socialist Party seemed to offer both. Hitler blamed the Bolsheviks and the Jews for Germany's disaster, which was music to many people's ears. When he became Chancellor in 1933, he immediately repudiated the terms of the Versailles Treaty, which had ended the First World War, reintroduced conscription, reinforced the police with his brown-shirt stormtroopers, and launched a crash program to restore the German economy. German industry was soon in high gear, but an ominous sign for those clear-minded enough to see it was the enormous emphasis which went into rearmament. All the major industrial giants and many of the smaller firms were working overtime to produce more and more aircraft, tanks, and U-boats. A new war seemed inevitable. After the success of the Polish campaign in 1939, Hitler turned his eyes west, and in the spring of 1940 overran Denmark and Norway. The Belgians, Dutch, French, and British didn't have long to wait for their turn. In May 1940, the German army, spearheaded by the new panzer divisions and paratroops, smashed through Holland and Belgium, trapped the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk, and pressed on towards Paris. A new word entered the dictionaries: blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Although the French actually had more tanks than the Germans, some of them of better quality, they didn't deploy them properly. Superior German training, tactics, and leadership won the battle for France. Apart from the tank, the ground support aircraft was now a decisive factor over the battlefield. Swarms of Stuka dive bombers acted as airborne artillery in the front line of the assault, attacking anything which moved with what was, for the time, pinpoint accuracy. It was not long before the French army was in full retreat and the panzer divisions were sweeping towards the Pyrenees. The French government abandoned Paris on the 10th of June, and Marshal Pétain signed an armistice on the 21st. Hitler's armies had achieved what the old Imperial German forces had been unable to do in both 1870 and 1914, and Hitler ordered a victory parade along the Champs-Élysées and through the Arc de Triomphe, built to commemorate earlier French victories. Prominent in the parade was some of the armored assault vehicles which had contributed to the German success, including Marder tank destroyers and Sturmgeschütz assault guns. The subdued French population were forced to watch. Self-propelled artillery pieces on fully tracked chassis, able to keep up with the tanks, were one of the many factors which contributed greatly to the German success, both in France and during the early weeks of the invasion of Russia the following year. The two principal types were the Hummel, or Bumblebee, and the Wesp, or Wasp, armed respectively with 150 and 105 mm guns. Captured French armoured fighting vehicles were also used both in Russia and later in Normandy after D-Day. A variety of field artillery pieces and anti-tank guns were married to old Hotchkiss and Renault tank hulls to supplement the hundreds of tanks and assault guns which were coming off the German production lines every month. Although in a sense improvised weapons, they were still deadly and played an important role in slowing the Allied advance on both the eastern and western fronts. One weapon almost unique to the German army was the assault gun. These were not improvised vehicles in any way, but were quite deliberately planned, designed, and built for the armoured assault mission. Having said that, they were also a means of mounting a more powerful gun on an existing tank chassis, such as the Panzer III or IV, than could be accommodated within their existing turrets. The assault guns had low, contoured superstructures with thick frontal armour, particularly on the gun mantlet. Their function was to accompany the infantry during an assault, adding aimed artillery fire to supplement the more general bombardment by conventional field artillery. Most had 75 mm guns, but there were also smaller numbers with 105 mm weapons. Having the same engines and chassis as the original tanks, the Sturmgeschütze were also able to keep up with the Panzers. Later versions of the assault guns had longer barreled guns with higher muzzle velocity, allowing them to be used as tank destroyers. By late 1944, in fact, half of many Panzer regiments were equipped with assault guns instead of tanks. Like the Stuka dive bomber, another weapon designed to inflict terror was the Nebelwerfer. The name simply means smoke projector and was a cover to conceal their real purpose. In fact, the Nebelwerfer was a multi-barreled rocket artillery piece produced in several versions from 150 to 320 mm caliber. With conventional artillery, shells can start arriving before you hear the sound of the guns firing. But the characteristic sound of the Nebelwerfers, like a herd of trumpeting elephants, was designed to intimidate and force the enemy to keep his head down. This was intended to allow friendly assault forces to get closer to the enemy lines before meeting retaliation. To give them extra mobility and allow them to keep up with the Panzers, Nebelwerfers were also fitted to the roofs or sides of armoured half-tracks, such as the Moltier or Mule. Most of these were assigned to the SS Panzer divisions in integral battalions. Army formations usually had to make do with towed versions of the Nebelwerfer. While the Soviet-Russian army did produce some self-propelled artillery pieces for the armoured assault mission, for the most part they relied on the T-34 tank, whose 76 or 85 mm gun could fire high explosive shells as well as armor-piercing rounds. The T-34 was the best all-round armoured fighting vehicle of the entire war and a major factor in almost every battle on the Eastern Front. The Russians also made extensive use of rocket artillery mounted on trucks. Called Katyushas, or Little Katies, they were produced in 4 different calibers, but by far the most numerous was the 132 mm or 5-inch version, which weighed 170 pounds and had a range of 10,000 yards. They were deployed for saturation barrages on the German lines prior to an assault, a technique known as softening up. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor at the end of 1941, it brought a whole new dimension to the whole course of World War II. The United States had carefully stayed neutral up to this point, but now they no longer could. Even in the face of the new enemy, though, and with several capital ships sunk or disabled, President Roosevelt decided to end the German menace first, to free Europe, and then to smack the Japanese down hard. Up to this point, even though the Russians were holding up well, Britain stood as the last country in Europe free of subservience in one form or another to the Nazis. The island of Britain would be used as an unsinkable vessel from which to launch the European crusade. British technology in support of the grand counter-invasion was not impressive. The little Bren gun carrier, with minimal armour protection, load-carrying capacity, speed or range, was still being produced in large numbers, even though it was a product of military thinking 20 years out of date. Fitting it with a flamethrower for the assault mission was hardly an answer. Nor in 1941 and 42 was heavier British armour much use in the assault role. The Matilda tank, although heavily armoured, could not fire high-explosive fragmentation shells. Apart from those already engaged in North Africa, most of the remainder were therefore shipped out to the Far East, where the few Japanese tanks deployed would be easy prey. The Matilda did gain a new lease of life, though, through being fitted with a flamethrower. The Japanese liked digging in, and their bunkers were often impervious to artillery fire. Not, however, to a 50-foot blowtorch. Despite the fact that it was really obsolescent, the Matilda also found a new lease of life, both in the Far East and in Italy in 1943, as a minesweeper. Equipped with a revolving drum at the front, which spun lengths of steel chain to explode any mines in its path, the Matilda Scorpion, as it was known, saved many lives and helped clear the path for successful assaults. Backing the Matildas, the other armoured fighting vehicles and the foot sloggers, the British had also developed a range of self-propelled artillery pieces to reinforce the armoured assault. Many of these had clerical names, and one of the earliest was the Bishop. This used a standard Valentine tank chassis married to a standard 25-pounder field gun in a thinly armoured box superstructure. It was typical British improvisation and almost totally useless because the gun wasn't suited to the anti-tank role and in its new mounting didn't have sufficient elevation to give it a useful high-explosive range. Like so many mid-war measures, it was a stopgap, as was the Sexton. This again had the 25-pounder field gun, but it was mounted in a better designed superstructure bolted to the top of a Canadian-built Ram tank, which itself was a variant of the American M3 Lee, which preceded the Sherman into service. Despite its mongrel ancestry, the Sexton saw widespread action in Italy and northwest Europe and actually remained in frontline service to as late as 1956. The United States equivalent of the Sexton was the M7, which, following their standard practice, the British promptly christened the Priest. This was almost identical to the Sexton, being based on the M3 tank chassis and hull, but instead of the 25-pounder, mounted the standard American 105mm M2 howitzer. Enormous numbers of M7s were built and formed the principal equipment of the Armoured Field Artillery battalions, integral to American armoured divisions from 1943 onwards. They played a vital and often ignored role in all operations, from the invasion of Italy to final victory in Europe. Preparations for the assault on the Atlantic coast of Hitler's fortress Europe had been well in hand since 1943. It was an enormous operation, an amphibious landing on a scale never attempted before, in which a large number of highly specialized armored assault vehicles would play a vital role. Meanwhile, in the months preceding June 1944, troops from the United States and Canada continued to pour into beleaguered Britain in their tens of thousands. Along with the further thousands of tons of guns, tanks, aircraft and military equipment of all shapes and sizes, it is a miracle that the island did not sink under the weight. The bucolic pre-war British way of life would never be the same again. This was a relatively small price to pay for the defeat of Nazism, but it would still cost thousands of lives because preparations to repel the invasion along the French coast were themselves very impressive. The Atlantic Wall consisted of miles of reinforced concrete gun emplacements, while the beaches themselves were covered by minefields and obstacles designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft. That was not all. Further east, just over the border into Germany itself, the Nazis had been steadily reinforcing their west wall, known to the Allies as the Siegfried Line. This bristled with concrete and steel obstacles to bar the path of the Allied armoured divisions, which German planners knew would be on their doorstep within weeks of a successful landing in France. The Allies were confident that Operation Overlord, the code name for D-Day, would be a success. Earlier in 1942, they had launched a trial assault, mostly conducted by Canadian troops, at Dieppe. Although this had not succeeded in achieving even the modest target set, it had given invaluable experience in what obstacles to expect and how best to overcome them. One of the many specialized armored assault vehicles developed for the attack on Hitler's European fortress was the Crocodile. This was a heavily armored Churchill tank with a flamethrower in place of the bow machine gun. The petrol and adhesive gel fuel for this terrifying weapon was carried in a trailer behind the tank, so if it was hit, the crew would not fry in their own oil. The Churchill provided the basis for several other specialized vehicles, collectively known as funnies. One of these towed a sledge containing bundles of wood known as fascines, which could be laid to make a path for wheeled vehicles through thick mud. Another version of the Churchill carried huge fascines on the hull itself. These could either be unrolled to create corrugated roads or dropped in bundles into anti-tank ditches to enable the other armoured assault vehicles to cross. One Churchill variant, designated ARC for Armoured Ram Carrier, lacked a turret and was intended to drive straight into ditches, creating a solid roadway over which other heavy armour could pass. This included the Churchill AVRE, or Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers, which had a petard mortar in place of the usual gun, firing a demolition charge to blast open concrete bunkers, plus a bridge which could be laid across ditches or used as a ramp. Even more impressive was the Churchill Jumbo, the forerunner of all modern bridge-laying tanks. Its hydraulic arms laid a 60-ton capacity bridge across trenches or small rivers. Alongside the Churchill Crocodile, the ubiquitous M4 Sherman was also modified as a flame-throwing vehicle for the close armoured assault mission. Two major types were developed. The standard E4 series flame gun could be fitted in place of the hull machine gun, while in the Far East, the Marine Corps had a version which used the Navy's POA Mark I gun fitted inside the normal 75mm gun barrel of the standard tank, or in an old 105mm howitzer tube mounted in the turret. Both types could either throw jets of pure petrol or petrol with a gelatin additive to make it stick to its target like napalm. It was found in combat that the mere appearance of a flame-throwing tank was enough to make the occupants of a bunker run out with hands held high. Another sort of firepower deployed on the Sherman was the T-34 Calliope rocket system, firing 64-inch rockets from a frame mounted above the turret. A variety of heavy metal rollers were fixed to the front of Sherman hulls to clear paths through minefields. None of these were particularly effective or widely used, but the most spectacular was nicknamed Aunt Jemima and had two huge 10-foot wheels. Another version, with typical GI humour, was called the Earthworm. The most successful mine-clearing variant, though, was the Sherman Crab. This had a revolving drum at the front, driven by an auxiliary motor. Steel flails fitted to the drum spun rapidly to explode any mines in their path, after which sappers would lay white tapes to denote the safe avenue for the following infantry. Phase 1, 5 beaches in Normandy were selected for the D-Day landings. Phase 2, the British and Canadians had those codenamed Gold, June and Sword, while the Americans used Omaha and Utah. Phase 3, British and American airborne divisions were dropped to secure the flanks. The assault began by a massive naval bombardment by every warship available. This, it was found afterwards, only inflicted minimal damage, but it woke the Germans up. Then the swarms of landing craft, accompanied by amphibious lorries called DUKWs and duplex-drive Shermans with canvas flotation screens, stormed ashore through the heavy sea swell. Many men were seasick, and some were drowned by the weight of their waterlogged packs before they even got ashore. German machine guns, mortars, and artillery raked the shoreline and pounded many of the landing craft into matchwood. Even so, in most places the opposition was lighter than expected, and the first waves of assault troops were soon pushing inland through the sand dunes. Not so on Omaha Beach, though, where nearly half the D-Day casualties occurred. One determined German commander and a regiment of veteran infantry managed to hold out for almost the whole day and continued fighting even when their forward positions were overrun. By this time, though, the assault infantry were being supported by more and more specialized armored assault vehicles as well as regular tanks. These included Shermans fitted with bulldozer blades to rip wide paths through the beach obstacles and create smooth roads through the sand dunes for the thousands of jeeps and trucks which followed in their wake. By the end of D+1, the Allied forces were firmly ashore and moving steadily inland. But now they encountered a rather different type of obstacle. Much of the Normandy countryside consisted of small fields divided by dense hedgerows, sometimes 5 or 6 feet deep. These gave concealment to German tanks, tank destroyers, and mortar and machine gun teams. Rather than advancing by leaps and bounds in this type of terrain, the daily gains were sometimes measured in yards, the infantry having to fight for every step of the way. To cut gaps in the hedges, an American sergeant devised the idea of welding improvised cutters to the lower hull fronts of Shermans. These were often made out of old lengths of railroad track or other scrap ironmongery, and the sergeant got a medal for his brilliant improvisation. The hedge cutter was really a great success, and with breakthroughs finally achieved at Caen and Saint-Lô, the Allies were out into the open French countryside. Huge numbers of fleeing Germans were trapped in what became known as the Falaise Pocket, and most of their tanks were destroyed. Paris was liberated, and the Allies fanned out north and east, pushing the Germans steadily back through Belgium and Holland and onto their own territory. This makes it sound easier than it actually was, because stubborn pockets of resistance held out in many of the Channel ports and fortresses like Metz and Verdun. To cap it all, just before Christmas, the Germans launched a major counter-offensive through the Ardennes, which meant the Allies didn't manage to break through the Siegfried Line and cross the River Rhine until March 1945. But the end of the European war was finally in sight, and Allied fighter bombers ranged at will over Germany. Before the end of April, the Allies had reached the River Elbe, which was the stop line agreed with the Soviet leader Stalin. Russian, British and American troops celebrated in a camaraderie which would soon be shattered by the Iron Curtain which descended across Europe. But meanwhile, Russian troops were in Berlin, Hitler committed suicide, and Field Marshal Montgomery took the surrender of all the German armed forces in the north of the country, while General Eisenhower accepted that of those in the south. There still remained one other enemy to defeat, though. Recapturing the dozens of Pacific islands which had been overrun by the Japanese demanded the development of specialized amphibious warfare techniques and the hardware to make them work. Large troop ships, which could not get too close inshore, opened their bow doors to launch the hundreds of smaller landing craft which were needed for each assault. Because such operations could not be conducted in secrecy, the defenders were usually fully alert. But once the Marines had clawed a foothold on the beach, larger tank landing craft then began ferrying the Shermans and other armored assault vehicles ashore. One which could drive ashore on its own was the Buffalo, a fully tracked amphibious armored personnel carrier developed specifically for the island-hopping campaign. These were first used on Guadalcanal in 1942, and later on Luzon, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Once a secure beachhead had been established, the Marines pushed inland along the narrow jungle trails. Little Weasel amphibious jeeps with tracks instead of wheels proved very useful. Sherman dozers played their part by pushing aside obstacles and smoothing out the so-called roads. Turretless Shermans were widely used as armored personnel carriers. And of course, the ubiquitous Willys jeeps were everywhere. Then the campaign came to a sudden, dramatic and terrifying conclusion. 2 atomic bombs dropped by the United States B-29 superfortresses destroyed the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the beginning of August 1945, and the Japanese sued for peace. The nuclear age had arrived, and with it, the Cold War. For the next 4 decades, the principal threat to world peace was seen as the Soviet Union. The communists' avowed intent was world domination, and their armored assault forces stood poised to sweep across Western Europe. The Red Army regularly practiced the assault techniques they would need, and attack helicopters such as the Mil-24 Hind became an essential component in the equation. Knowing they would have several wide rivers to cross during an invasion, the Russians developed an extensive range of amphibious armored personnel carriers and other assault vehicles so that the momentum of the advance would not be slowed down. These included the BMP, which not only had a small gun turret to give the infantry covering fire when they were debussed, but could also carry wire-guided anti-tank missiles to protect them from enemy armor. One wartime weapon which remains in widespread service, although in a more sophisticated version, is the Katyusha. This version is the 122mm BM-21 system mounted on the outstanding Ural 375 truck, which has exceptional cross-country performance. Russia has three other types of Katyusha, the BM-24, 25 and 27, firing rockets of 200, 220 and 250mm caliber, showing the importance placed on rocket artillery to deliver a saturation barrage. All 40 rockets on the BM-21 can be ripple-fired in 30 seconds, landing 3/4 of a ton of high explosive on a target anything up to 9 miles away. German experience in World War II had also taught them the importance of sustaining the momentum of the advance. For this reason, they have developed a range of armoured assault vehicles designed to operate closely alongside the Leopard 1 and 2 main battle tanks, right up in the front line. One of these is the Panzer Armoured Recovery Vehicle. It is basically a Leo 1 without a turret, but with a 35-ton winch. This can tow other vehicles out of the mud, including the Leopard tank itself. On the battlefield, one of its principal tasks would be recovering damaged vehicles to tow them back to workshops, and the Panzer is also fitted with a dozer blade and 20-ton crane. Another variant is the Pioneer Panzer, or Armoured Engineer Vehicle. This has an auger for drilling holes and planting demolition charges. One of the most important Leopard versions in the assault role is the Biber bridge layer. Although both the Leo 1 and 2 have deep fording capability, using a telescopic conning tower for the commander, many rivers are still either too deep or have banks too steep for the tanks to cross on their own. Within minutes, it can extend its aluminium bridge over an obstacle 22 yards wide. This bridge is deployed horizontally rather than lifted overhead, making the Biber less conspicuous to the enemy. The bridge itself can carry a 60-ton weight, enough for any NATO tank except the heavyweight British Challenger. The Armoured Engineer Vehicle can even change the engine of a Leopard in the field in about 20 minutes. Both the 830 horsepower engine in the Leo 1 and the 1500 horsepower version in the Leo 2 have quick-release couplings. Once these are undone, the engineer vehicle uses its crane to lift the old engine out and replace it with the new one, which is carried on top of the hull. This means that a breakdown will not seriously slow up an armoured assault, and the full range of specialised Leopard variants is a key factor in ensuring that mobile forces are not held up. One of the most important factors in modern armoured warfare is protecting the tanks from low-flying aircraft and especially from helicopters. Back in the late 1960s, an international consortium collaborated to produce a sophisticated armoured anti-aircraft vehicle based on a stretched Leopard 1 hull and chassis. The result was the Gepard, which is still, 30 years later, one of the most effective weapons on the modern battlefield. The core of the system is the twin 35mm Bofors cannon, which can engage a target at 3,000 to 4,000 yards and demolish it with their 550 rounds a minute rate of fire. The turret revolves through 360 degrees, and the guns themselves elevate to 85 degrees, allowing them to engage a target approaching from any direction. On top of the turret, the search radar revolves constantly, seeking for targets up to 10 miles away. Once a hostile aircraft has been identified, the crew cut in the tracking radar on the turret front, and once this locks on, the inboard computer takes over, holding the aircraft in its sights regardless of how wildly it maneuvers. In the event of a computer failure, there is also an optical sighting system so the guns can be controlled manually. Operating closely alongside the main battle tanks, the Gepard is a vital ingredient in the armoured assault mission. A more modern design, still being developed for the armoured assault role, is Trinity, a collaborative venture between neutral Sweden and Switzerland with some United States input. It is a marriage between a Bofors 40mm quick-firing gun and a MOAG 8x8 armoured personnel carrier, hull and chassis. The important factor is the gun and integrated fire control system, which could be fitted to many armoured fighting vehicles. Like the Gepard, the Trinity system incorporates a constant search radar to detect hostile aircraft using an IFF, or Identification Friend or Foe Questioning Pulse. If the answer is hostile, the tracking radar locks on. The current vehicle carries only 100 rounds of ammunition, which are normally fired in 10-round bursts, limiting its battlefield endurance. However, the computer programs the proximity fuses in the projectiles while they are actually in flight, and they can actually hit an incoming guided anti-tank missile at about 3,000 yards, a helicopter at twice that range, or even a supersonic fighter aircraft. Just as important to NATO in the armoured assault role as the previous two weapon systems is the British Chieftain bridge layer. This is a close contemporary to the German Biber, but was developed jointly between Lockheed in the United States and the Fighting Vehicle Research and Development Establishment in the United Kingdom. The idea was for an armoured bridge layer which would take the weight of the Chieftain and the new tanks then under development, the M1 Abrams and the Challenger. The Chieftain bridge layer is thus larger and heavier than the Biber and relies on the old-fashioned but well-proven system of unfolding through the vertical in 3 stages, up, down and away. The Margate Bridge is slightly longer than the German equivalent and can span a river 26 yards wide. On top of this, the width of the steel roadway is such that it can not only take a main battle tank moving in one direction, but two-way traffic of smaller and lighter vehicles as well. Whereas the majority of specialized vehicles designed for the armored assault mission are conversions or adaptations of existing tanks or armored personnel carriers, the British Army decided to design a custom-made vehicle. This is the Combat Engineer Tractor, which itself is completely unarmed apart from individual weapons carried by the crew, but is invaluable in helping the fighting vehicles to get on with their own missions. Digging firing pits using its bucket shovel so that tanks can operate from hull-down positions is just one function. Having done one job, the combat engineer tractor can then speed onto its next task at 35 miles per hour on a paved surface. This performance allows it to keep up with the forward waves of an armoured assault group. It also has good cross-country mobility and lightweight aluminium armour to protect its crew while it gets on with the task in hand. Moving a roadblock using its dozer blade to clear a path for other armoured fighting vehicles is no problem. Weighing only 17 tons, the tractor is also amphibious, the preparations taking only about 10 minutes. First, the splash board is erected, then the steering cowls over the water jets are checked. The last thing to do is inflate and strap the buoyancy bag in the shovel. In the water, the tractor can travel at near 6 miles per hour and is more manoeuvrable than many boats, being able to turn in its own length. If the riverbank on the other side proves too steep or slippery, the combat engineer tractor can hoist itself by its own bootstraps using a rocket-propelled anchor. This automatically rights itself when the 8-ton winch takes up the strain and digs itself in so that the tractor can haul itself up a 45-degree slope onto firmer or more level ground. The tractor has many other uses, such as helping engineers push a girder bridge into position if a river is too wide for a chieftain bridge layer to span. The standard American combat engineer vehicle is the M88, based on a modified M60 tank hull and chassis. Although its armour protection is better than on the British tractor and compares with that of the German Leopard, the M88 is not as versatile, even though its 45-ton winch can get any main battle tank out of trouble. The vehicle also has a boom crane for any heavy lifting jobs and a dozer blade to give it stability, although this is not designed for digging. What the United States Army does have to give superlative fire support in any armored assault mission is the 155mm M109 self-propelled howitzer. This is capable of firing tactical nuclear shells as well as conventional high-explosive rounds to a range of over 15 miles. The vehicle is based on a modified M113 armored personnel carrier chassis and has the same lightweight aluminium armor, which means the 25-ton vehicle can be made fully amphibious within minutes with the help of just 9 buoyancy bags. Accompanied by its M548 tracked ammunition resupply vehicle, the M109 can go anywhere a tank can go at speeds of up to 35 miles an hour, allowing it to keep up with the leading edge of any assault. As in almost all modern armored fighting vehicles, its crew are also fully protected against nuclear, bacteriological and chemical warfare hazards. For saturation fire effect during a modern armored assault mission, one of the most potent weapons in the NATO inventory is a direct descendant of the German Nebelwerfer and Russian Katyusha. This is the Multiple Launch Rocket System, or MLRS. After protracted development, it is now in service with the British, French, German and Italian armies, as well as the United States. An area denial weapon with a significant tank-busting ability, the solid fuel rocket weighs 600 pounds and has a range of 18 miles. 12 are carried in the launch frame, which swivels through 90 degrees for firing, and they can be fired either singly or in ripple salvos. The carrying vehicle is a much modified M2 Bradley with an armoured cab at the front for a crew of 3 or 4. This also contains the inertial navigation system and fire control computer. The tracks give good cross-country mobility to allow the MLRS to keep up with an armoured assault, and it has a top speed of 40 miles an hour. The MLRS system was a significant factor in the armoured assault phase of the Gulf War in 1991. Another very useful weapon for broaching Saddam Hussein's border defences was the Chieftain AVRE, or Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers. In place of the normal 120mm gun, the turret is fitted with a massive 165mm petard mortar for bunker busting. The AVRE can also tow a trailer containing the giant Viper mine-clearing device. This consists of a segmented plastic hose 250 yards long containing plastic explosive. It is towed through the air over a minefield by a cluster of 8 small rockets and blasts a path 24 feet wide for the following tanks. Like the wartime Churchill, the AVRE can also carry fascines to create paths over soft ground or fill-in trenches. Apart from the MLRS, artillery support during the Gulf War was principally supplied by the M109 self-propelled 155mm howitzer. Although in the heat of the desert its crews usually operated with the armoured cab open, this could be quickly sealed in the event that the Iraqis did start using their Scud missiles with poison gas warheads. Fortunately, that did not happen, but all the coalition troops in the Gulf were well drilled in gas mask procedures and kept a medical kit ready to hand at all times, containing a disposable syringe to administer an antidote. In the meanwhile, the M109s just kept blasting away at the Iraqi Republican Guard. Even heavier fire support for the armoured assault was provided by 8-inch or 203mm M110 howitzers on tracked armoured chassis. Like the MLRS, this has a range of 18 miles and is gradually being phased out in favour of the rocket system. The deadline for Saddam Hussein to withdraw his troops from Kuwait finally ran out on Sunday, February the 24th, 1991, and the Allied troops braced themselves for the onslaught. The Iraqi forces had already been weakened and demoralized by the air campaign over the preceding weeks. But now, the Allies opened up a 2-hour barrage all along the Saudi Arabian and Kuwaiti borders. This barrage was more intense even than that which had preceded Montgomery's famous victory in another desert at El Alamein almost exactly 50 years earlier. MLRS played a vital role since. Apart from conventional high explosive, its warhead can also contain large clusters of 644 hollow charge mines or small anti-personnel mines, or the revolutionary sense and destroy armor projectile. This is a smart weapon which penetrates the overhead armor of tanks using kinetic energy alone. There is literally no defense against it, as the Republican Guards found to their cost. Within a couple of days, their ranks had been decimated, their tanks destroyed, and Kuwait had been freed. It was a clear vindication of the wide range of high-tech equipment developed over recent years for the armored assault mission.